Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Academy for Teachers masterclass on LGBTQ plus youth and sexual assault with Shamus Khan. My name is David Buddy. I've been teaching English for the past 6 years. One of the things that I love the most about our job is getting to witness the next generation, specifically as they find their voice through language arts, and watch as they develop critical thinking skills and empathy through reading and writing, which just continuously provides me sort of against all odds with hope for a more inclusive and just future. I really admire this next generation, and just being able to work with them as they find their voices is just increasingly important in this era that seems to be just so debilitatingly fraught. I'm also very honored to be a fellow of the Academy for Teachers. It's an organization that has facilitated the best teacher PDs that I've personally encountered, and always just leaves me feeling so invigorated and really just legitimately respected as a professional, which I think is kind of rare in my personal experience. Today, specifically, I have the honor of introducing Shamus Khan, a professor and chair of sociology at Columbia University, soon to be at Princeton, and co-author of Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus, among countless other articles, books, essays, and contributions to the field that have totally just moved the needle. Shamus is a decorated and accomplished author and scholar, and we are very lucky to have him here. I personally am especially excited about this masterclass because I'm passionate about supporting LGBTQ students. I'm a gay teacher myself, and I understand that can be a really delicate balancing act, especially teaching younger students. While school environments may have improved broadly for these students, just sort of speaking from personal experience, I think that there's such a long way to go. And our queer students require very unique support during this time in which they're at home. It's often the most vulnerable place for a young queer person to be. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with an expert and with like-minded professionals. But Shamus is not the only star of this masterclass. It's also my honor to introduce the teachers here today who were selected from many applicants. This is an impressive group with advanced degrees in English, counseling, education, literature, psychology, and special education. We teach grades pre-K through 12 in public schools, charter schools, and independent schools. We're mostly English teachers, and we teach expected subjects like creative writing and journalism, but you'll also see flashes of individuality and passion in courses with titles such as Universal Justice and Theory of Knowledge. And the number of extracurriculars is impressive. Just to name a few, we coach yoga and figure skating. We lead groups such as the Asian Diversity Group and Poetry Out Loud. And one of us even leads a podcast entitled Shh Periods. So there's a great deal of teaching experience here today. We've been in the classroom between 3 and 27 years, and the total number of years we've been teaching is 238. We teach between 15 and 434 kids each. The number of children who know our names in total is 3,023, and that is this year alone. So your real audience today, Shamus, are those 3,023 kids, because every teacher here will in some way share with them what we learned from you. The ripple effect of a masterclass is immense and unknowable. So thank you, Mr. Khan, for being here. Thank you to my fellow teachers for teaching, especially now. And with that, let's get this show on the road.
Thank you so much for the kind and generous introduction, David. And it's a pleasure to see you all. As Sam knows, the Academy of Teachers is near and dear to my heart, and something I've been engaged with since I met Sam, I think in 2010 at the New York Public Library. I'm just going to dive right in and to talk about some of the research that this is based on, and then some kind of insights or heuristics that may be helpful for you. And I would encourage you all to interrupt as you wish. There's nothing worse than sitting on Zoom and watching somebody talk at you for a long time. And so, hands up, anything like that in terms of an intervention is really welcome. I don't plan on talking the whole time, obviously, but I just thought, if as I'm speaking, there's something that you want to interject with, please do. And I'm speaking in part on the basis of some work that I've done, but it's work that I've done with 30 other people. And so as part of a massive research team that did this big study where we spent 5 years studying the sexual experiences of students at Columbia College and Barnard. as well as the School of Engineering and the School of General Studies. And the idea for this project was to kind of change the conversation on sexual assault, to move the needle in how we were thinking about it. And some of my own inspiration on this um, comes from thinking about the work, actually not in sexual assault, but in race and incarceration of Khalil Muhammad. And Khalil Muhammad is a historian and former director of the Schomburg Center who wrote this incredible book called The Condemnation of Blackness. And in that book, what Muhammad argues is that um, something really important happened in the early part of the 20th century, right around the Progressive Era. And what happened was that where white people were thought of as people who committed criminal acts, Black Americans were portrayed as being criminals. So there was a difference between an act that you might commit and a type of person that you were at your very core. And this insight of Muhammad's has always had a pretty profound effect on me when thinking about people, right? About whether or not there are things that we do or types of people that we are. And when you look at the popular media, you see like um, shows like Criminal Minds, right? Like there's personality types primed for deviance. The racist under under support of this idea is really strong. And I sort of started to think about the ways that we also think about assault and perpetrators and how it's a type of person who does this kind of thing. And they're fundamentally pathological and they are fundamentally broken. And in this insight, I sort of thought to myself, well, wouldn't it be great if the criminal justice arm of the progressive movement and the sexual assault arm of the progressive movement or of any movement came together a little bit and had a conversation and asked about what the consequences of understanding responses purely in terms of punishment looked like. And instead, what if we shifted the conversation to think much more about prevention? So, what would it mean to think about sexual assault in a way that doesn't say that the solution is to find a right way to respond to sexual assaults after they happen, but instead to prevent them from happening in the first place? And uh, what ended up happening is with, as I said, 30 other researchers, we designed a series of studies, quantitative studies, qualitative studies, so interviewing hundreds of students for up to 6 hours each about their sexual experiences, being embedded in student life, so hanging out in dorms and fraternity and sorority basements and religious student organizations. And the book, Sexual Citizens, ends up being kind of a portrait of what it's like to be a college student today and why it is that sexual assault is such a predictable part of the college experience. And so that predictability, what we mean by it is that it happens really frequently. And it's not the case, I will definitively tell you, it's not the case that most sexual assaults are committed by sociopaths. Most sexual assaults are committed in the context of some relationship. And I don't mean dating relationship, but most people are assaulted by somebody they know and by somebody that they've had some previous contact with. It is the case that it's predominantly men who commit assaults, primarily cisgendered men. But if we think about assaults, one of the things that's really, really sobering is also the realization that sexual assault is the highest within the LGBTQ community. And if you have a model of assault that is based on social pathology, what you end up looking at is why is it that the LGBTQ community is filled with sociopaths? Like, why is it that they're so much more likely? And because most people in the LGBTQ community who are assaulted by someone they know and a fellow community member. And so what this pushed Jennifer Hirsch, to look at was to begin to try and think of a different way to look at assault and to understand it. And in our book, Sexual Citizens, we generate kind of three main concepts that we draw upon. And I'm just going to drop into the chat for those of you who are interested. Jennifer and I have, we have a bunch of discussion resources for the book, which is both on how to discuss the book, but then 10 lectures that we've given on assault, understanding assault, some that have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, race, LGBTQ students, how we did the study, what the main concepts are. So those are, videos that you guys can use in your own teaching or share with people if you want, et cetera. So the three main concepts are sexual geographies, sexual projects, and sexual citizenship. And the idea of a sexual project, it's the answer to the question, what is sex for? And you may think only an academic could ask the question, what is sex for? But as it turns out, the answer to that question isn't that easy. That sex is sometimes for pleasure, but most sex for young people isn't that pleasurable. That often people have sex for a variety of reasons, to advance their status or the status of a group that they're a part of, to have a new kind of experience. And one of the things that we saw, particularly among the LGBTQ students, was that sex was an integral part of identity formation. And my argument there isn't that for LGBTQ students, it was that they're highly sexualized. It's that the experience of sex was an experience of coming to understand themselves, where part of their sexual project was coming to understand their own identities. And so the reason sexual projects is an important concept is that it's really important for people to understand what their sexual projects are. And time and again, what we saw over the course of our research was that many people had sat down with young people in high school, middle school, elementary school, and talked to them about the importance of their career. Who do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do? Especially in high school, and particularly at a place like Columbia. But very few people had ever talked to the young people that we interacted with. In fact, no young person told us the following story. Someone important in my life sat me down and told me that sex was going to be a really important part of my life. It was going to be a way that I connected with some of the people who were the most important to me. And I needed to figure out what I wanted from that part of my life. And I needed to figure out who I wanted to be. And I think the failure for us of not having conversations with young people about their sexual projects is part of the reason why we have really high rates of sexual assault. And I'll explain why in a little bit. I'll also just highlight to you that college is way too late to have these conversations. The strongest predictor of being assaulted in college is having been assaulted in high school. And that comprehensive, age-appropriate, medically accurate sex education is one of the most important things for preventing assault. In our quantitative research, we found that for women who had had comprehensive sex ed that included practicing refusal skills, those women were half as likely to be raped in college. I mean, I'll just say that again. Women who had comprehensive sex ed that included practicing refusal skills, those women were half as likely to be raped in college. There's a problem with that stat, which suggests that it's all on women and women just need to know how to refuse better. So I want to lift that up and say, that's not what I'm arguing, but that's a huge effect. I mean, it's as effective as the flu vaccine, right? And so we actually have things that could work and they need to come to students at earlier ages. And I'm happy to talk, and we should talk about what comprehensive sex ed looks like for younger students, including elementary students, because there are lots of things that you all do all the time that are sexual assault prevention strategies, like telling kids not to touch or grab and to use their words. That is a sexual assault prevention lesson. And one of the things that we might do as educators and as a community is connect those lessons to the lessons of who it is that we are in our sexual lives. In addition to sexual projects, we have the idea of sexual citizenship. And the concept of sexual citizenship is really it's laden. We didn't initially want to use the word citizen because comes with all of this baggage of citizens and non-citizens and what that means. But we mean it in a way of the initial concept was sexual self-efficacy, or the right to sexual self-determination. But it is Jennifer and I's way of bringing morality into discussions of sex, but not a morality that is the classic morality of who you're having sex with, but instead a morality of how you're treating the person that you're having sex with, or how you're having sex. And what we found time and again was that young people did not have a fully developed sense of their own sexual citizenship. That means that they didn't have a fully developed sense of their own right to say yes to sex and their right to say no to sex. And the first part of that is actually really important, a right to say yes to sex, because so much of what young people experience is a denial of their sexual citizenship. And this happens really extremely among LGBTQ youth, a denial of their right to their own sexual expression. And that denial of their right to their own sexual self-expression had real impacts on young people. Um, Today, I'm going to describe stories from the book and stories of people as they recounted them to us. Those stories are going to be hard, so just I want to flag that. And if you need to like take a moment, please take a moment for yourself. But one of the young men that we spoke to, we call him Adam in the book, told us about growing up in a really kind of conservative social environment in the Midwest, where his family didn't acknowledge his sexuality and in fact was pretty aggressive in denying it. And Adam described like life in New York as a gay man, which he didn't love. He was like, I've met people on Tinder and Grindr, and like they all say that they're interested in like meeting with me, but then they just like want to hook up and then ghost me, right? So he was like, it wasn't like the most pleasant experience for him. And he finally met somebody on campus who was his boyfriend, and he was super excited about it. He was like, it was so great to have a boyfriend. And he said, the only problem is my boyfriend's pretty forceful about sex. And then he told us a story about how his boyfriend came home one evening pretty drunk, and in Adam's words, he basically raped me. And Adam hadn't told this to anybody, hadn't told it to his boyfriend, hadn't told it to his friends because he was worried his friends would suddenly stop liking his boyfriend. And he refused to categorize it as an assault because the relationship was so valuable to him. Now, part of that story can't be understood without a previous denial of Adam's sexual citizenship, about a notion of his right to say yes and no to the kinds of sexual experiences that he wanted to have. The final concept that we use is sexual geographies, and we mean physical space here. And space ends up being really important. So David raised in his introduction the idea of how students are at home right now. And so for many of them, that's a really challenging place to be. One of the things that we know is in the social sciences, there's this idea that like space isn't just a backdrop where things happen, it actually produces interactions. It's a critical player in who we are and how we act. So, if you and I were hanging out somewhere like a formal restaurant, we'd probably act differently than if it were at a dive bar. Or at a religious service. And it's not that like we're schizophrenic people. It's that the space produces different kinds of interactions. And in our analysis, one of the things that we know is that, if two young people in college are hanging out together and they decide to go somewhere more private and they go back to one of their rooms, that room typically has 4 pieces of furniture: a desk, a chair, a bureau, and a bed. If they're going to sit together, where are they going to sit? On the bed. And like that doesn't produce sexual assault. It's not causal for sexual assault. But there's a way that that spatial environment changes the meaning of simply sitting down together. And it's because beds have meanings. And so analyzing space and access to space becomes really important about who has access to space, what spaces people feel comfortable in, and who has control over space. In the book, one of the things that we do is analyze how maleness, cisgendered maleness, and whiteness are intimately tied on campus to control over space. And how this, you see this in, for example, in the fraternity system, where I didn't know this, some of you may know this, like that sororities by national rule cannot serve alcohol. And so what that means is that like fraternities are given sort of the rights of distribution of alcohol on campus within Greek life systems. And it's pretty astonishing to me. It's a highly gendered rule, but it basically gives typically cisgendered white men control over a huge portion of the party space on campus. And so, like, that spatial dimension of campus life, control over space, becomes really important. So these three concepts, I think, we use to analyze the experience of students at Columbia. But I think that there might be ways to use them to explain the experience of students in many other contexts. To think about, what a sexual project is, and when we begin to talk to young people about that, what are the steps that we can take to help young people develop a sense of their own right to self-determination, which includes sexual self-determination, and a deep sense of moral obligation to recognize other people's rights. So, like Adam's boyfriend had a deep sense of his own right to his sexual self-determination. What he didn't have was a sense of the moral obligation to recognize Adam's equivalent right. And so sexual citizenship encapsulates both the idea of that right and the recognition of the equivalent rights in others, or recognizing the fundamental and respecting the human dignity of everyone else. And then geographies, primarily geographies of experience and inequality, where control over space becomes critically important. And it's where kind of a classic power analysis comes in for us. I want to say one last thing. In the book, we talk a lot about not just gay and lesbian and bi experiences, but the experiences of people who identify outside the gender binary. And so whether or not that be queer identifying in their gender identity or trans. And one of the things that we saw there that was very powerful was how people don't have to have power to use power. And this is like a very like Foucauldian idea, but it can also be understood pretty kind of straightforwardly. So we don't need to talk about like capillary power and like the uses of power. We can think, about a story, for example, that one person, we call them Maddie. They use they them pronouns. We call them Maddie in the book, and they talk about how they were experiencing a non-trivial amount of depression. And that experience of depression had put them on a series of meds that suppressed their sexual desires, as well as the experience of depression in general, which had made them just less desirous of sex. And their partner found this very difficult. And basically like used an enormous amount of emotional manipulation in order to extract sex. And Maddie described this one experience where their partner said to them, "You don't think I'm beautiful." And for Maddie, this hit really hard. Like, because Maddie's partner also used they them pronouns and identified outside of a gender binary, and was also similarly kind of Maddie and their partner were both transitioning in their gender identities. And they didn't have clarity on what they were transitioning to, but certainly away from something. And Maddie had a deep sense of like what it felt like not to be beautiful, what it felt like not to feel like everyone else thought that you were repulsive. And so this, "You don't think I'm beautiful," hit Maddie hard. And, Maddie said, "I'd said no, I'd said no, I'd said no." And then they said, "You don't think I'm beautiful." And then I just lay there and let it happen. And it's an instance that's like, is that an assault? I mean, I have a very strong view on that. It doesn't matter to me, because like what matters is the harm that Maddie experienced, and that, that we had so many stories, not necessarily of assaults, but just fundamental unkindness and failure to recognize the other in experiences. And so for Maddie, I think, you know, that was an instance where an analysis of power that just looks at how like one person is super powerful, like, and the other person is not super powerful, misses how Maddie's partner in that moment could also use power. And so that an education in how it is that we extract things from other people by using power, not necessarily having it, but using it to our advantage, becomes really important. Okay, so that's kind of the conceptual apparatus. And I want to talk about like, so what does this mean practically? Like, how do you actually talk with young people about something like this from ages 2 to 22 or 82 even? And this is something that Jennifer and I are working a lot on because the life of this book is something that has a life well beyond just the book. We're trying to change public policy. Um, well, some of these concepts, like comprehensive age-appropriate sex education that develops a robust sense of sexual citizenship, a lot of that, what is sex ed at younger ages, isn't about sex. It's about respecting other people's bodies and recognizing their fundamental humanity. And one of the challenges for later sex ed is that often the moral lessons that we instill in young people are not connected to the sexual education that we provide them. So sex ed is frequently very medicalized, right? Like we teach people about ovaries and fallopian tubes and how the egg travels out of the ovary into the fallopian tube into the uterus, right? And I guess it's an important thing to know that, but like it's sort of like teaching somebody to drive by explaining the role of spark plugs in the internal combustion engine. Like it doesn't make you like it is a helpful thing to know if you own a car, but like it's not actually essential for being a good driver. And so I think one of the things that we might think about is how do we connect all of the moral lessons about what it means to be a good person to sex and sexuality? And how do we sort of not give all the ground about moral conversations about sex to a very narrow view of morality that's presented primarily on the right? Like, I think that part of our responsibility is reclaiming a language of morality where that morality isn't about sitting in judgment of other people, but instead insisting that we all recognize and respect the dignity of others. And that sex ed that fails to do that settles on a highly medicalized view, that doesn't connect the lessons that a 2-year-old gets, like about not grabbing, using their words, to as a 14, 15-year-old about what sex ed looks like, a 12-year-old, I think that is a sex ed that isn't necessarily successful. And I am one that like perhaps super naively is optimistic about universalistic language here. Universalistic language that's deeply inclusive, that says that recognizing the fundamental human dignity of others, whether that's a project of racial justice or gender justice or a project of justice for the queer community, it's the same project. And that sex ed can build upon diversity, equity, and inclusion work in that way by talking about the necessity of fundamental respect and human dignity. Now, there are particular challenges for the LGBTQ students, and I think that, and here, I don't know, how many of you have seen the tea video? The tea video, the consent, it's as simple as a cup of tea. It's a really cute, great video that I hate. I don't like actually hate it, like I'm just being kind of playful there. But there's the tea video is this like, it's a video that it's like, someone may say they want tea and then you make tea and then they don't want it, don't force them to drink it, right? Like someone may come over to your house and you may make tea and they pass out, don't pour tea down their throat, right? Like it's like a clever thing about consent education. And I can talk for a long time about the limits, the benefits, but also the limits of consent education. But the thing about the T video is that it's stick figures. And people are disembodied in the T video. And the problem with that, it's like, it's an attempt to be inclusive of a wide variety of gender identities and sexualities. If you just make a T video with stick figures, you don't have to say what the gender of people is, or what their genders are. You don't have to, presume heterosexuality. You don't have to presume anything. The problem is that like people don't live disembodied lives. And we can't talk about consent and the experiences of consent without a gendered analysis of power. And similarly, like we can't fully have a conversation about recognizing the rights of other people and their sexuality with also recognizing their sexuality. And so I think this is a really hard line for folks, and I'd be curious to know if people feel like they've had successes or challenges in having this conversation, especially when people's identities are emergent and not yet fully um, uh, understood by themselves or others. But I think that we can't have generalized conversations about this kind of stuff because, like, we live in a world of gender. We live in a world of sexuality. We live in a world of race and power. And to talk about experiences abstracted from that doesn't really recognize the kinds of situations that people are going to find themselves in. And so I think like one solution. Yeah.
Maybe
Want me
we
to stop? Yeah, I've been blathering for too long.
No, you haven't been blathering. It's fascinating, but I think probably people have questions for you, and they may
Yeah.
have responses to what you just brought up.
Yeah, so I'll pause and yeah. Thank you, Sam.
Heather's hand is up too.
Sure.
Oh, okay, I didn't see Heather's hand. So Heather.
Thank you so much for bringing up the T video. I am one of the designated condom access program people in our high school, specifically for the queer community in our high school. And we do a presentation about consent every year, as you know, with our, here's what we offer. And a couple of years ago, 3 of our juniors came to me and the other woman who does it and specifically asked to remove the T video. We used to use it. And their rationale was that it made light of a very serious subject, and they had been victims of sexual assault, and it made them feel, I don't remember the word they used, they were very eloquent about it, but it made them feel really terrible that people were laughing about something that had really damaged their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it was a great viral video. I don't know that it was a great education tool. And, it's wonderful that you have a space where students are willing to come and talk to you about those experiences, that you've created that. And I'm just curious, like, how you felt you were able to create a context where students had that level of trust to be able to raise it.
I don't know. I mean, as an English teacher, we talk a lot about sensitive subjects, and I'm really careful, regardless of what my opinion is, to leave space for all kids' opinions, and not judge. I'm really, really mindful of that, and try and accept whatever they say, and if it's damaging to the community in our classroom, I'll usually address it, usually in a constructive way. So I think kids learn which teachers are willing to step up and, speak the truth and treat them like adults and not like children, like, oh, we're not going to talk about that. In other words, it's like, let's talk about it in a mature way and figure it out.
I'm curious also for the other English teachers, you know, so many of the texts that we deal with over the course of educating young people have really challenging moments in them of sexual assault, which frequently aren't named as such. You know, you kind of can't get through a Jane Austen novel without some, you know, either direct or intimated moment where something has happened that leads to, you know, a kind of crisis. And I'm curious, like, how those conversations, you guys have managed them.
Shamus, I think we have a hand up, Adam, and then Amanda
Okay,
as
great.
well.
Thanks.
Adam, you want to go first?
Yeah, so so many questions, but I guess my one first question is around convincing administration to take on the task of comprehensive sex ed, just because I feel like you can't really do it on your own, and you know, you can inject some of these conversations into situations with kids, but you know, it's always the thin line I feel like you're walking as a teacher. And so just that, and are there any programs or organizations that you particularly recommend that you think do a great job with it?
Yeah, I mean, Jennifer and I aren't in program development, but the OWL curriculum from, I don't know if any of you know this, the Our Whole Lives, which has both a religious and a secular sex ed, is outstanding. And so I think it also takes a life course perspective. And so a life course perspective meaning it's the Unitarians have put out this like you know, different stages of your life and the different kinds of sexuality education that you can get. And so it is not, there is a secular version. So just so you, like, it would not require you. And it really is, you know, from my perspective, and this is not what I research, but you know, like I don't do program evaluation of what the most effective sex ed is. It is the best that I've seen. And if others have suggestions of things that they're using, that would be super helpful. In terms of convincing you know, an administration about the importance of this, I mean, some of it is just how effective it is at reducing harm. And I want to just point out to you that like there is broad-based bipartisan support for sex ed. You may not know that, nobody knows that, but like, as it turns out, there is a small, very vocal anti-sex ed part of the population, but overall, it's quite broad. The second thing is that like most sex ed is not sex ed. It's not like actually an education in how to physically have sex, which is what so many people fantasize about or imagine when they're talking about sex ed. And so I think one thing that we've worked on is like the branding problem of sex ed, which is that it has like the word sex in it. And Jennifer and I actually very pro having the word sex in it, not because we're pro sex, but like if we think about sex as a dirty, rotten, nasty thing that you should only do to someone after you're married, like it is not a great vision of what sex can be in people's lives. But I think like pointing to one, the broad-based support of this, and then two, the, you know, the huge life course benefits that it has. And here, you know, you should reach out to me if you want. The best research group that does this is here in New York, called the Guttmacher Institute. And they basically study the effects of these kinds of things. And they have like one pager after one pager talking about the science behind its effectiveness. And maybe I'm naive because I'm like a social scientist and I'm like, people are going to be convinced by the science, which like, I don't know. I promise I haven't been asleep for 4 years, but like, you know, I do think there is a broad coalition, and I'm part of a coalition right now in the state of New York that is pushing this forward on the legislative agenda. as it turns out, teachers unions are deeply opposed to comprehensive sex ed, because a lot of those unions are concerned about, one, like underprepared teachers being asked to do sex ed, which could potentially be harmful. Another unpaid mandate that's being pushed upon teachers. I mean, there are good reasons why the unions tend to be opposed to this. So I'm not anti-union, nor am I angry at the unions for doing that. But so part of the coalition has been figuring out a way to make that a little bit more possible.
Amanda, you want to jump in?
Sure. Hi. Thank you so much. That was really informative and interesting. My question, I think, was sort of already answered. But I was wondering, I'm really interested in the policy side of education and sort of everything you were just talking about on that side. And I was thinking about how politicized everything is right now, but I think education and sexual education in particular. So how do we get this sort of comprehensive, I don't know, I like the way that you use moral, education in classrooms when it feels like everything is politicized. But I guess you answered it, that it really is maybe like a small but very vocal group that is anti-comprehensive sex ed, and maybe that's just what I'm hearing, and I have like a misunderstanding of the political landscape in that way.
Well, I mean, small vocal minorities can be very powerful. So, I mean, look at gun control, look at abortion. If you look at all of these things, the majority of Americans, the vast majority of Americans are pro gun control, significant support for access to medically responsible abortions. I mean, there's just, and all of those things are things that, it's not like there can be a bipartisan policy consensus that still loses. So I don't think it's your naivete. You probably look at the world. I've just provided a link to Guttmacher. I think another thing for us to think about, and, is to get back to moments that allow us to have conversations that aren't sex ed conversations. So like, I taught before with Sam in this Academy for Teachers. I once taught Gadsby because my another part of my life is as a scholar of inequality and elites. It's kind of actually the main part of my life. And in Gadsby, I don't know if any of you are English teachers who've taught it before. There's a moment where folks where he ends up in an elevator coming back from Harlem, and the elevator guy says, "Stop playing with the handle," and it's kind of this like joke. And then Nick wakes up the next morning, and there's just this line, like Nick wakes up the next morning with the photographer, and his like sizable portfolio was like between his legs, right? And like it is pretty, explicit in what that means. And yet I remember like I read Gatsby like 3 times in high school and in college, and like no one, and I self-identified as queer, and like I don't know that I was like fully cognizant of like what had happened in that moment. And so I think that there are moments where we can like raise up this conversation and say like, what has happened? Like, in the Gatsby moment, like the physical abuse that exists within the relationship between the gas station and car attendant owner and his wife, like, is ripe for a conversation that then is a conversation about how we treat one another. And so there are openings there. There are openings throughout history and the social sciences. I think that there are moments of potential, a challenge that I sort of identified was like sex ed gets kind of put in a little silo, like a little place where we do it. And what would happen if like we took it out of that silo and we made it like we normalized the conversation a little bit? And to return to the idea of like LGBTQ youth, like it's, the normalization of a conversation about, sex. It's not like LGBTQ youth are the people who are questioning their sexuality in life, right? the only way you'd think about like LGBTQ youth as questioning their sexuality and not everyone else is if you thought that everybody else had a natural sexuality and LGBTQ youth had an other sexuality, right? Like all students, all young people, all adults have experiences of questions about their own sexuality. And so, you know, raising that up as a moment of conversation, which can be done in a biology class, it can be done in a range of spaces, I think is a moment for you to like have a sex ed conversation that isn't necessarily about sex. Like a lot of sex ed conversations aren't about sex. The you know the arguments that we're making are frequently not about like making a strong argument about teaching. Like one last thing and then I'll stop. Like we do not take a strong like enthusiastic consent pro-sex approach, right? And the reason for that is that like I don't actually want sex to be boring, but I kind of want it to be boring. Like I want it to be a normal part of what it means to live a fulfilling life and something that we have conversations about with one another. And like religious spaces are primed to do this. You know, all kinds of places are primed to have that kind of conversation.
Absolutely. Lucy, do you want to jump in? Your hand was up.
Thanks a lot. This goes back a bit to the question about English teachers and texts, and I'd be really curious about what you, my colleagues, have experienced. But what I've noticed over the years of teaching English in middle school, and I've taught 6th and 7th and 8th, is that basically through 6th grade in middle school, there isn't supposed to be any sex. There's no sex at all in books. It's not allowed. It freaks everyone out, especially parents, but really everyone. And then suddenly in 7th grade, there's this magic that occurs over the summer, I guess. And they go to 7th grade and they can read Of Mice and Men. And then the first conversation that has some sort of connection to sexuality is about rape and the threat of rape. And there's sort of like, there's no preparation for that. There's not a trajectory that makes sense. And often in the private schools where I've taught, they're also studying Latin and Greek mythology, which is just like rape story after rape story after rape story. And so sometimes I feel like the education of literature becomes this strange space where it's just like sexless, 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 and then it's a course on rape. And there's so many missing pieces, and there must just be so much that's internalized, questions that kids don't even realize how to ask, that sometimes I wonder if that's sort of like the big project that I need to take on in the second half of my teaching career, or whatever it is I have ahead of me, is like, what is the way to make some of that a little bit more coherent for kids? Because it must just be so disconnected and confusing. Do other people have that experience, or is that, I don't know if that's a specific, like kind of old fashioned private school literature curriculum thing, or what?
No, that's very relatable, because in our school, we used to teach the absolute true story of a part-time Indian, and that had some masturbation scenes. And so not only were the masturbation scenes cut out of the curriculum, some parents would rip those pages out or staple them together. And then when I was in school and we had biology, our textbooks had the, full frontal human anatomy thingamabob, and parents would rip those out of textbooks or color over the woman bits, not the man bits, with Sharpie. And we would get like a lot of pushback from parents saying like, I'm going to report you to Channel 4 News, blah, 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 because you're teaching my kids about like all these deviant notions of like femininity, or no, sorry, not feminine, feminism and consent and like what to do with body autonomy. Like we can't have that. So yeah, no, very relatable. Public school in the Bronx, it still happens.
I was actually just going to say that I think that one of the things that I've seen in my now 14-year career as a mostly teacher of reading and English is that I've seen like a positive shift in terms of books that represent positively the LGBTQ experience. And I found that that has been like a really interesting entry point for kids. These are generally not books that we're teaching as part of our curriculum. However, we do now have one school that teaches George as part of the curriculum, which I love. It's such a beautiful story, especially for younger grades, like 4th and 5th graders, and they just love it and they gravitate towards it. And so I think that for me, I was curious about your thoughts, Dr. Khan, kind of on like this wave of authors doing a much better job, at least from my experience as an educator and as a reader, a real avid reader of YA fiction, but like kids being able to see themselves and their experience and their sexual orientation, or at least different sexual identities represented in children's literature and young adult literature.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's wonderful. And I think it's also important to think about what, cisgendered heterosexually identified students can take away from that as well. That, part of, one of the things that I struggled with in the writing of this book was like not having a chapter on LGBTQ people, right? Like where you tell like, this is the normal story, and then here's like the variation on that story, right? But, the kind of think about like a good relationship is a good relationship. Like, and it doesn't quite matter who's involved. And, maybe if we want to get super radical, like how many people are involved, et cetera. It's like, is everyone treated with respect and dignity, and do they do the people grow together? And, how are you going to bring that into being? And I think, heterosexual students can learn a lot from that. And so I think it's great that that's happening. And I think what will be really important is to make sure, like, and I'm not intimating, Lauren, that you suggested this at all, but like, that it's not for the gay students, like it's not for the queer identifying students, it's for all the students. And, that we, there's I'm a little bit of a quantitative social scientist, and there's this thing that we point out again and again and again. There's always more variation within than between. So if you take two categories, cisgendered men and women, there's more differences between women than there is between women and men. Or if you take two categories, like, African American and Asian American, there are more differences among Asians than there are between African Americans and Asian Americans. And so I think like with that as kind of a foundational piece, it's like, how can we all, these positive examples of, either healthy relationships or healthy decision-making, where sometimes maybe it's not focusing on the negative relationship, but the healthy decision to walk away from that relationship. The difficult but healthy thing that we can do to sort of successfully extricate ourselves from a toxic context, like maybe not focusing on the toxicity, but that the model for like, well, what was the decision to walk away? How would you make that decision? I will say one thing that I said, like, for women who had comprehensive age-appropriate sex education that included practicing refusal skills. I'm sorry to be such an academic in my hedging, but let me be really clear that critical feature of successful sex ed is practicing. Every student we spoke to could parrot back to us consent and its importance. But when we asked them how they actually did sex, never appeared. And so, having people not just imagine doing something, but actually practicing doing it becomes super important. And, this is why I think for all of us, like emphasizing that like practicing being in a healthy relationship means like actually practicing being in that relationship, not avoiding relationships and figuring that you'll figure it out later. And those relationships, I mean broadly construed. I don't mean like, relationships on a pathway to marriage. I just mean friendships and things like that. I mean, this is the other thing, is like building those bridges between what it means to be in a healthy, intimate situation, whether that intimacy is friendship or sexual, like thinking about what that is and how you're going to bring it into being. And, we'll stop.
Thank you so much. I think we probably have time for one last question, or maybe some final thoughts, Dr. Khan. Anybody? Oh, Adam, do you have one last question? Or?
No, sorry, my hand was still up.
Oh, okay.
I took it down.
So I'll just say, I think I lost a little bit of the line of like the LGBTQ youth. And I want to just reemphasize like why it is that LGBTQ youth experience such elevated risks of sexual assault. And the book that Jennifer and I have written is like, in some ways it's super hackneyed. Like it's basically about power. And we build upon a classic 70s explanation of gender and power and how you can't understand assault without understanding gender and power. And what we add to that is pretty simple. We say like gender is not the only form of power in a society. Class and race and ability, and in this case, sexuality is a form of power. And so I think, for me, I'm 42 and, somebody who grew up in a context that wasn't super like open or supportive of my sexuality. It's so different now, like in a way that I'm pretty positive about, but I think it's easy to lose the recognition of just how systematic still the denial of the rights of non-cisgendered heterosexual people are, how systematically those are denied. And whether or not you look at suicide rates or you look at rates of sexual assault, what you see is that it happens kind of again and again and again. And so, I think we have a lot of work to do. And that those prevention efforts, the kind of like the take home that I always say with this book, whether or not it's on LGBTQ people or anything, is that like the ultimate sexual assault prevention strategy, and Sam probably won't be shocked to hear me say this because it's like me, is like it's equality. Like equality is a sexual assault prevention strategy. And if we can think about how we build spaces that are more equitable and how we build understandings of encounters that are more equitable, where we always recognize the other person's equivalency, and how we recognize the legitimacy of the different kinds of projects that people are trying to enact with their sexuality, if we can create equality around that, I think we can go a long way to both helping prevent sexual assault, but also making it so that like, that queer students, students who struggle to pay their basic needs, students with disabilities have the highest rates of assault. It's not surprising. And so, I feel like I'm preaching to a choir of people who've dedicated their lives to this. And so some of it is like, keep up that good work, because you may not think you're doing sexual assault prevention when you're giving lessons about equality and human dignity, but that's actually exactly what you're doing.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Khan.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a blessed evening, everyone.
Thanks so much.